Nobody buys yams that have already started to turn. That is the first thing anyone at the Ledbetter Feed and Seed will tell you, and they told it to Odessa Farrow more than once that afternoon, the words landing soft and certain the way advice does when a man is sure he is doing you a kindness. She stood at the loading dock with a push cart she had borrowed from the church basement, and in front of her sat 500 seed yams in slatted crates, some of them soft at the ends, some of them furred over with the pale gray bloom of rot, all of them written off. The buyer from the produce cooperative had passed on the whole lot that morning. The crates had been sitting in the sun ever since, sweating, and the smell coming off them was the sweetish, fermenting smell of things that had begun their return to the ground. Odessa did not seem to mind the smell. She stood there and looked at those yams for a long time without saying anything, long enough that the men leaning against the fertilizer bags stopped their talk to watch her. And when she finally moved, it was only to reach into a crate and turn one of the tubers over in her hand slow, the way you might turn a stone you were thinking about keeping. The man who owned the crates was named Boyce Tumlin, and he had already decided he was going to have to pay someone to haul them off. So when this narrow slip of a girl asked what he wanted for the lot, he laughed before he answered. $20, he said, and take the crates too, because he was tired of looking at them. He said it to be rid of her. She counted the bills out of a folded envelope and handed them over, and the men by the fertilizer bags laughed the easy laugh of people watching someone make a mistake they themselves are too smart to make. Now, before we go on, if you have ever had something told you that what you were holding on to wasn't worth the trouble, do me a small kindness and tap that like button and leave a comment telling me what town or county you're watching from, because I like to know where these stories travel. Say it plain, your city, your corner of the country, and then stay with me, because what Odessa Farrow did with 500 rotting seed yams is a longer story than $20, and it does not go the way those men expected. To understand why she did it, you have to know that she had come back to Harlan Creek in the tail end of that winter with no plan she could have written down. She was 22. Her mother had gone north years before, chasing work in a city that swallowed her up so completely that the letters stopped coming, and her father had never been a fixed point to begin with. So when the county sent word that her great-aunt Lucretia Farrow was living alone out on Buckthorn Road and getting too old to manage the place, there was no one else to send. Odessa quit a job filling orders at a warehouse where the light never changed and the floor was always cold, packed 2 duffel bags, and rode a bus most of a day, and then a truck the rest of the way out to the low green country in the eastern part of the state, where the Farrows had held the same 40 acres since before anyone kept good records of such things. She told people she had come to help her aunt. That was true. She did not tell them she had nowhere else she needed to be, because that was also true and harder to say. The place was not much, a farmhouse with a sway-backed porch and a tin roof that sang in the rain, a barn that leaned a little into the prevailing wind, as though it had been listening to something for a long time and had bent to hear it better, and the land itself, most of it gone to weed and volunteer pine, because Lucretia had not been able to work it for years, and there had been no one to work it for her. But the soil under all that neglect was good. It was a deep, reddish loam that held water without drowning a root, the kind of dirt that other farmers in flatter, sandier country would have driven 100 miles to stand on, and Odessa knew enough to know that much, even if she did not yet know what she meant to grow. Her great-uncle Ambrose Farrow, dead now 11 years, had farmed it all his life, and there were people around Harlan Creek who still said his sweet potatoes were the best that had ever come out of that county. They said it the way people say things about the dead, half praise and half burial, as though whatever he had known had gone into the ground with him. Lucretia met her at the door with a face that gave away nothing. She was a small woman gone spare with age, her hands knotted at the knuckles, and she wore a man's flannel shirt and rubber boots even indoors, not out of confusion, but because she had spent 70 years dressing for work and saw no reason to dress for anything else now. She looked Odessa up and down and said, "You favor your grandmother," and that was the whole of the welcome. But she made room. She cleared out the back bedroom that had been used for storing feed and quilts, and she let the girl settle in. And for the first week she watched more than she spoke, which Odessa did not mind, because Odessa was a watcher herself and recognized the habit. In the evenings the old woman sat by the stove and shelled beans or mended, and the two of them would pass a whole hour without a word. And it was in one of those hours that Lucretia said the thing that would turn out to matter, though neither of them marked it at the time. She said, "Your uncle used to say the ground remembers what you plant in it, so be careful what you teach it." Then she went back to her beans. Odessa did not go looking for rotting yams. What happened was that she went into Harlan Creek that late winter afternoon to buy fence staples and chicken feed, and she stopped at the Ledbetter feed and seed the way everyone did, because it was the place where the county's business got done and its opinions got aired. And she overheard the men talking about Boyce Tumlin's ruined seed stock and the trouble of hauling it off. She might have walked past it. She almost walked past it. But something in her, some inheritance she could not have named, made her go around back to the loading dock to look, and once she looked she could not stop looking, because she saw what the buyer from the cooperative had not bothered to see. Most of those yams were not rotting. Some were. But most of them had only softened at the cut ends where they had been handled rough, and under the gray bloom the flesh was firm, and a seed yam does not need to be pretty to sprout. It needs to be alive. And she could see, turning them in her hands, that a great many of them were still very much alive. There is a kind of knowledge that does not come from books, and Odessa had gotten hers the summer she was 9, the only summer she ever spent whole on that farm, when her great-uncle Ambrose was still living and had let her follow him up and down the rows. She had forgotten most of it, or thought she had. But standing at that loading dock, the memory came up out of her like water finding an old channel. The way he had cut a seed yam into blocky pieces each with an eye. The way he had bedded them in warm sand under glass to draw the slips. The way he had said that a sweet potato was not a seed at all, but a promise the plant made to itself, and you only had to keep the promise from breaking. She bought the 500 because she could not stand to watch a promise get hauled to the dump. She did not have a plan. She had a truth she recognized in $20, and sometimes that is all a thing begins with. She loaded the crates alone while the men watched and did not offer to help, and the springs of Lucretia's old truck sagged under the weight, and she drove the winding grade out of town and up Buckthorn Road with the smell of fermenting yams filling the cab, and she was not ashamed of it, though she knew how it looked. When she pulled into the yard, Lucretia came out onto the porch and stood with her arms crossed and looked at the crates for a long time, the same way Odessa had looked at them. And Odessa braced herself for the old woman to say she had wasted good money on garbage. But Lucretia did not say that. She came down off the porch slow, on account of her hip, and she reached into a crate and took out a yam and pressed her thumb into it and turned it and set it back. And then she looked at Odessa with something moving behind her eyes that had not been there before. She said, "Your uncle bought a rotten lot once. Back in '58. Folks laughed at him too." Then she turned and went back inside and left Odessa standing in the yard with 500 yams and the first small warmth of the feeling that she had not been entirely foolish, which is a dangerous feeling to give a stubborn person, because it will make her patient, and patience is the one thing the men at the feed store had not counted on. That first evening she sorted them by lantern light in the barn, because the daylight had gone and she could not wait until morning, which was itself a sign of the thing that was starting in her. She built 3 piles, one pile for the yams that were truly gone soft all the way through, weeping and dark, and these she carried out to the far edge of the garden plot and buried in a trench, because Ambrose had taught her that even ruin has a use, and rot fed back to the ground comes up again as something else. That pile was smaller than anyone in town would have guessed. The second pile was for the yams that were firm and clean and would keep, and there were a good number of these, more than she had dared hope, and she stacked them careful in a dry corner on a bed of straw. But it was the third pile that held her attention longest, the yams that were soft at one end and sound at the other, the wounded ones, the ones the cooperative buyer had lumped in with the dead because he was buying by the crate and not by the yam, and it was these that she meant to save. She sat on an overturned bucket with a paring knife and worked late into the night, cutting away the spoiled ends, trimming down to the living flesh, cutting each sound yam into blocky seed pieces, each with at least one eye, the way her uncle had shown her. And by the time the lantern guttered, she had a washtub full of pale wet seed pieces and hands that smelled of earth and starch. And she went to bed sore and did not remember lying down. The next morning Lucretia found her in the barn again, building beds, and did not ask what she was doing, only watched, and after a while said, "You'll want them warmer than that," and pointed with her chin at the corner where the morning sun came through the east window. So Odessa moved the beds. She filled shallow wooden flats with sand hauled up from the creek bottom, and she bedded the seed pieces cut side down and eye up, and she covered them with more sand and set old window sashes over them at an angle to catch the sun and hold the warmth, and she watered them with water she had let sit in a barrel to lose its chill. Then she waited, and the waiting was its own kind of work, because a person who has decided to save a thing must resist the urge to keep uncovering it to check, and Odessa made herself resist. She kept a notebook, a cheap spiral thing she bought at the drugstore, and in it she wrote the date she bedded them and the number of flats and the temperature she guessed at by feel, and she began, without meaning to keep a record of a thing that no one had asked her to record, which is how most real records begin. She did not tell anyone in town what she was doing. She did not have to, because a small county keeps no secrets, and word had already gone around that the Faro girl had bought Boyce Tumlin's rotten yams for $20, and the word went around with a laugh attached to it. At the feed store, the men turned it into a small ongoing joke, the way men do. There was one among them, a big landowner named Verl Cathy, who ran 400 acres of row crop over on the good bottomland along the river, and who considered himself the practical conscience of the county. And it was Verl who put the joke into its hardest form. He said, sitting on a stack of feed bags with his thumbs hooked in his belt, that you could pour all the sweat you wanted into ruined stock and all you'd grow was a lesson, and that girl was going to learn what her uncle should have taught her before he died, which is that there's ground worth farming and ground worth leaving, and Faro ground was the second kind. He said it not cruel but certain. The way a man states a fact he has never once been made to doubt, and the other men nodded, because it sounded like wisdom, and it had the shape of wisdom, and it was wrong, though it would take the better part of 3 years for the county to find that out. Odessa heard about it because someone always makes sure you hear about it, but she did not answer it, not then. She had learned young that arguing with a certain man only makes him more certain, and that the only thing that changes such a man's mind is the one thing he cannot argue with, which is a result he can see with his own eyes and taste in his own mouth. So she said nothing. She went home and turned back the sand on one flat, just one, near the end of the second week, and there they were, the first pale sprouts pushing up from the eyes of the wounded yams, curled and blind and reaching, and she covered them back over gently and wrote the date in her notebook and did not tell a soul. That night at supper, Lucretia looked at her over the beans and said, "They came," and it was not a question, and Odessa said they came, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. The ground had made its promise. Now it was on Odessa to keep it from breaking, and she meant to. Spring came slow to that country, the way it does in the low hills, with false starts and late frosts that catch the careless, and Odessa was not careless. She hardened off the slips before she set them, carrying the flats out into the sun by day and back into the barn by night, letting the young plants toughen against wind and cool. And she watched the almanac and the sky and the behavior of the dogwood, which her uncle had trusted more than any calendar, and she did not set a single slip into the field until she was sure the ground had truly warmed. She had chosen a plot of about 2 acres on the south-sloping side below the barn, ground that had not been worked in a decade and was thick with dormant weed and the roots of volunteer pine, and she cleared it by hand and with a borrowed mule from a neighbor 2 farms over, an old man named Pruitt Dabney, who did not laugh at her. Or if he did it privately and lent her the mule anyway. She turned the soil in long, slow passes, and she built it up into ridges the way Ambrose had, because a sweet potato wants a loose high ridge to run its roots down into, and by the time she was done her hands had gone hard and her back had learned a new set of aches, and the 2 acres lay before her in clean red ridges like corduroy laid across the hillside. Setting the slips was work she did on her knees. She pulled the sprouted slips from the flats when they had grown a hand tall, snapping them off clean above the seed piece so the mother yam could send up more, which it would, and this was a thing the town men did not understand, that 500 yams properly handled do not give you 500 plants, but many thousands, because each seed piece is a factory that keeps producing slips as long as you keep pulling them. She set them in the ridges astride apart, tucking each one into a hole she made with a dibble stick, firm in the soil around it, and she worked from can see to can't see, day after day, until her knees were stained permanently red and Lucretia had to remind her to eat. The old woman helped where she could, which was not much on account of her hip, but she came out in the cool of the mornings and sat on a stool at the end of a row and pulled slips and handed them up, and she talked more in those mornings than she had all winter, telling Odessa things she had not known she remembered. How Ambrose had always set his slips after a rain when the ground was soft. How he swore the plants set in the dark of the moon rooted stronger. How he had kept a certain kind he called the buckthorn red that had come down through the family, and that he would never sell his seed to anyone outside the county because he said a good line was a thing you kept. That was the first Odessa had heard of the buckthorn red, and she asked about it, and Lucretia went quiet for a while, and then said that the line had likely died out when Ambrose did, because no one had kept it going, and that the yams Odessa had bought from Boyce Tumlin were just ordinary market stock, nothing special, the kind everyone grew. Odessa took that in and set it aside, but it stayed with her, the idea that there had been something particular that had been let go. And that night she went up into the loft of the barn where Ambrose's things had been stacked and forgotten after he died, boxes and crates furred with a decade of dust, and she went through them by lantern light. She found tools and seed catalogs from the 60s and a broken barometer, and finally, in a wooden cigar box gone soft at the corners, she found his notebooks. There were 4 of them, small and bound in cloth, filled front to back with a cramped, careful hand, and they were the records of a lifetime of growing, the dates of every planting and every harvest going back 40 years, the weather, the yields, the varieties, and folded into the last one a single sheet of paper on which Ambrose had written, in a hand shakier than the rest, so near the end, the words, "The buckthorn red keeps best and sweetest. Hold it back from the frost, and it will feed you when nothing else will." Odessa read that line 3 times, and then she read it again, and she did not yet know what it would come to mean, but she felt the weight of it settle into her the way a seed settles into a ridge, out of sight, waiting on its season. Through that first summer the plants ran. A sweet potato in good ground and good weather will make a vine that covers the whole ridge and reaches into the row and knits the field into a single green cloth, and by August Odessa's 2 acres had gone from bare red corduroy to a sea of green so thick you could not see the ground under it, and the vines put out their pale morning glory flowers at dawn, and the bees came, and the field hummed. She weeded it by hand until the vines closed over and smothered the weeds themselves, and she watched the sky and prayed the right amount of rain, and it came more or less, and she carried water in the dry stretches to the plants nearest the barn where she could reach with a hose. She did not use much of anything she had to buy. She could not have afforded to. What she put into that field was the buried rot from the first sorting, turned under and broken down into black crumbling richness, and the leavings from Lucretia's chickens, and her own labor, which cost her nothing but everything, and the field took it all and turned it green. People driving up Buckthorn Road slowed to look, because 2 acres of anything growing well is a sight in a place where most of the small farms had gone to seed, and some of them, she knew, were the same people who had laughed, come to see whether the joke was holding up, and the joke was not holding up. Though no one would say so yet, because a sweet potato does its real work underground, where you cannot see it, and the county would have to wait for the harvest to know what she had grown. She lifted the first hills in late September on a cool, bright morning after the vines had begun to yellow at the tips, which was the sign her uncle's notebook said to watch for, and she did it alone at first because she could not wait, working a fork down under a hill and levering it up slow, and the ground broke open, and there they were, a whole clustered family of sweet potatoes hanging from the crown, red-skinned and heavy and clean, more from that single hill than she had any right to expect, and she sat back on her heels in the dirt and looked at them for a long time, the way she had looked at the crates on the loading dock, in silence, letting it be true. Then she called Lucretia out, and the old woman came and looked, and knelt down with difficulty, and picked one up and hefted it, and she said, "Well," and then she said it again, "Well." And there were things in that single small word that a paragraph could not have held. They dug the 2 acres over the next 2 weeks, the both of them and old Pruitt Dabney, who came without being asked, and the yield was such that Odessa filled the barn and then filled the smokehouse and then began stacking crates on the porch, and when she totaled it in her notebook she had grown, from 500 rejected yams bought for $20, better than 11,000 pounds of sweet potatoes, and she sat with that number a long time, and did not tell anyone in town, because she had decided that the tellin' would not be done in words. She cured them the way Ambrose had written, in the warm dark of the barn with the doors mostly shut, letting the skins toughen and the wounds heal and the starch turn slowly to sugar, which is the thing most people do not know about a sweet potato, that fresh from the ground it is not at its best, that it needs weeks of curing to become sweet, and that a cured yam and a green one are as different as green fruit and ripe. She cured them for 3 weeks, turning them, checking them, writing it all down, and then in the middle of October she loaded the truck with a few crates of the finest and drove down into Harlan Creek, not to the feed store, but to the little grocery on the square that was run by a woman named Alva Renner, who bought local when she could and who had known the Farrows a long time. Odessa carried in a crate and set it on the counter and said she had sweet potatoes to sell, and Alva looked at them and picked one up and looked at Odessa and said she'd heard about the rotten yams, and Odessa said these weren't those, or rather these were those, and let the strangeness of that sight, and Alva took a chance and bought the crate and put them out front with a hand-lettered sign that said Farrow Sweet Potatoes, and that, though no one knew it, was the first crack in Verl Cathy's certainty, though it would be a while yet before the crack ran all the way through. The first person to come back for more was a man who had bought a few on a whim and roasted them and had never tasted anything like it, and he told Alva, and Alva told Odessa, and Odessa did not say much, but she wrote it in her notebook, the date and the words the man had used, which were that they tasted like something he remembered from childhood but could not place. That was the Buckthorn Red talking, though Odessa did not know it yet, because among the ordinary market stock she had bought from Boyce Tumlin there had been, by pure accident, a scattering of yams that were not ordinary at all, yams that had come originally from Ambrose's own line and had gotten mixed into the general seed stock somewhere down the years, and Odessa, saving every living yam without knowing which was which, had saved those too and grown them out along with the rest, and they had crossed and multiplied in her 2 acres, and the sweetness the man remembered from childhood was the sweetness of a variety that had nearly died with the old man who bred it. But that discovery was still ahead. What mattered that October was that people started coming back. Not many at first, a few. But they came back, and they told others, and by the first hard frost, Alva Renner had sold every crate Odessa brought her and was asking for more, and the sign in the window had customers seeking it out, and the joke at the feed store had gone quiet without anyone deciding to stop telling it. Winter that year was a season of accounting. Odessa sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and Ambrose's 4 notebooks spread around her, and she read the old man's records the way another person might read scripture, and she began to understand that she had stumbled into something he had spent 40 years learning. She learned from his pages which of the many yams she had grown had the deep flavor and which were merely large because he had noted such things, and she began that winter to sort her own seed stock for the coming year, not by size but by taste and by keeping quality, holding back the best flavored and best keeping yams to grow out again, which is the slow, patient work of building a line, the work Ambrose had done and no one had continued. She did not know the word for it. She knew only that she was choosing the promises she wanted the ground to keep, and in the cured potatoes stacked in the barn she found, when she cut into them through the winter for their own table, that some were extraordinary, sweet almost as candy when roasted, with a smooth, deep flesh, and she began to set those aside and mark where in the field they had grown. And she asked Lucretia if these might be the buckthorn red, and Lucretia cut one and tasted it and went still. And after a while she said, "That's it, that's your uncle's. I'd know it anywhere." And she did not say anything else because she had started to cry, quiet, the first time Odessa had ever seen it, and Odessa left her alone with it, because some things a person should be let to feel by themselves. So Odessa had, without planning to, recovered a thing that had been given up for lost, and she understood by then what she had, or she understood enough, and she made a decision that winter that the men at the feed store would have called foolish if they had known of it, which was that she would not sell the buckthorn red as seed, and she would not sell it cheap, and she would not try to grow it big and fast. She would build it slow. She would hold back her best each year, and grow the line out a little larger each season, and she would sell the eaten yams to whoever wanted them, and let the wanting spread on its own, the way her uncle had. And she would not borrow money to do any of it, because Ambrose's notebooks had a hard warning in them about a year in the 70s when he had borrowed to expand, and the crop had failed, and it had nearly cost him the farm. And he had written, "Never let the bank plant your field, plant it yourself and small," and she took that as law. That is the thing that people who tell this story sometimes miss, that Odessa's slowness was not timidity, but strategy, that she had read in a dead man's hand the whole map of how not to lose, and she followed it, and it was the following of it, more than any single stroke of luck, that made the difference in the end. The second spring she planted 4 acres instead of 2, because she had the seed for it now, grown from her own held-back stock, and because Alva Renner had sold out so early the year before that there was clearly room for more. She did the work the same way, by hand and with Pruitt Dabney's mule, refusing to hire the plowing done or buy equipment she would have to owe on. And she kept her notebook, and she planted the buckthorn red in its own separate plot at the top of the slope where the drainage was best, and she guarded it like a secret, which it was. That summer old Pruitt Dabney's grandson, a lanky, quiet boy of 15, named Transome Kell, whose mother had sent him out to the country to keep him out of trouble in town, started coming around to help, first for a little pay and then because he liked it. and Odessa taught him what she knew the way it had been taught to her, by doing it beside him and saying little, and the boy took to it. And it was good to have a third pair of hands, and it was good, though Odessa would not have said so, to be teaching instead of only learning, because a thing you can teach is a thing you truly know. That was the summer word truly began to travel, and it traveled the way real word travels, which is not through advertising, but through mouths. A woman who had bought Odessa's yams at Alva's grocery took them to a family gathering 2 counties over, and everyone asked where they came from. A cook at a diner on the highway started buying them by the bushel and putting them on his menu and telling every trucker who passed through about the little farm up Buckthorn Road, and the truckers carried the word down the highway in both directions the way they carry everything. A man who wrote a column for a regional paper about country food came out and sat at Odessa's kitchen table and ate a roasted buckthorn red, and wrote about it in language that embarrassed Odessa when she read it, and the piece ran, and after it ran the letters started coming, and the cars started coming up Buckthorn Road, and Odessa found herself, in the second autumn, unable to grow enough to meet what people wanted, which is a problem. But it is the good kind of problem, the kind that pulls a thing forward without a person having to push it. It was that second autumn that Verl Cathy came up Buckthorn Road. He came alone, in his big truck, on a gray afternoon near the end of the harvest, and he did not come to buy, or he did not say he came to buy. He said he had been passing, though there was nothing up Buckthorn Road to pass to but the faro place, and Odessa knew what it cost a man like that to drive up a road that led only to the thing he had said would fail. She was in the field lifting the last of the hills when he pulled in, and she stood up and wiped her hands on her jeans and waited, and he got out and stood by his truck and looked at the 4 acres, the great heaped crates, the barn full to the rafters, the line of a few cars parked along the road where people had come to buy, and he was quiet for a long time, the way she herself went quiet in front of a thing she needed to take in whole. Then he said, "Well, you proved something." And she said, "I wasn't trying to prove anything." And he said, "I know. That's why it stings." And there was, in that, an apology, though he did not use the word, and Odessa did not make him use it, because she had no need of it. And making a man grovel is a small pleasure that costs more than it pays. She gave him a buckthorn red to take home and try, and he took it, and he did not say much else, and he drove back down the road, and that was the whole of it, no ceremony. But it was the moment the county turned, because if Verl Cathy had come up Buckthorn Road, then anyone might, and after that everyone did. He came back a week later, and this time he said his piece plain, standing in her yard turning his hat in his hands, that he had been wrong, that he had said things at the feed store he wished he hadn't, that he'd farmed 40 years and thought he knew ground, and it turned out a girl who'd never farmed a day had seen something in that ground and that stock that he'd been too sure to see. And he asked, and this was the thing that surprised her, whether she would sell him seed of the buckthorn red, because he wanted to grow it on his good bottomland. And she thought about it a while, in front of him, in the silence he had learned to wait through by then, and she said no. Not because she was punishing him. She said no because the line was small yet, and she meant to keep it in the family ground a few more years, until it was strong and stable, and because her uncle had written that a good line was a thing you kept, and she meant to keep it the way he had, close, until it could stand on its own. Verl took the no better than she expected. He said he understood, and she thought he did, and then he offered, without being asked, to lend her the use of his equipment for the plowing come spring, no charge, because it pained him to watch her break 4 acres by hand and mule when he had a tractor sitting idle. And this offer she thought about too, and this offer she took, but only part way, letting him plow the eating yam acres while she kept the buckthorn red plot to the mule in her own hands. because some things you do not let a machine do to a thing you are trying to keep particular. And Verl, to his credit, understood that too. The third year the farm fed the county, and it is worth saying plainly what that means, because it is easy to say a phrase like that and let it slide past. It means that in the autumn of that third year, there was hardly a table in the county at the harvest gatherings and the church suppers and the family Sundays that did not have farro sweet potatoes on it, because Odessa was growing 8 acres now and lifting better than 40,000 pounds. And Alva Renner had a standing order, and the diner on the highway had a standing order, and there was a produce buyer, a different one than had passed on the crates that first day, who drove out to the farm himself and took what Odessa would sell him and carried it to stores 3 counties over. It means that a food bank in the county seat that fed families through the hard winter months put out the word that they needed keeping vegetables, and Odessa gave them, without making a production of it, better than 3,000 pounds of good cured yams that would hold in a cool cellar until spring, because a sweet potato cured right will feed you when nothing else will. And she had read that line in a dying man's hand and had come to understand. It was not only about a family, but about a place. It means that a thing bought for $20 at a loading dock, a thing everyone had agreed was worthless and had laughed at a girl for saving, had become, in 3 years, one of the things the county fed itself with. And it had happened not through some sudden stroke, but through the slow keeping of a promise, ridge by ridge, season by season, the patient work adding up the way patient work does quietly, until one day you look up and the whole county is eating from a field that was supposed to have taught a girl a lesson. The feed store men, the ones still living and still gathering, told the story now with the laugh turned around, told it on themselves, which is the only honest way a certain kind of man knows how to admit he was wrong. And Boyce Tumlin, who had sold her the crates, took to saying that he'd known there was good stock in that lot all along and had practically given it to her as a favor, which was not true. And everyone knew it was not true, and no one corrected him, because a small county lets a man keep his small vanities so long as he does not do real harm with them. And Odessa let them tell it however they wanted, because the telling did not matter to her. It had never mattered. What had mattered was the ground and the promise and the keeping of it, and those she had attended to. That autumn, Lucretia died. She died the way she had lived, without fuss, in her own bed in the farmhouse on Buckthorn Road, on a cool, bright night after a good harvest day. And Odessa found her in the morning looking peaceful and small, still in the man's flannel shirt she had never seen a reason to stop wearing. And Odessa sat with her a long time before she called anyone. Sat in the quiet the two of them had shared all those evenings by the stove, and did not cry right away, because the grief was too large yet to fit into crying. And only later, out in the field, kneeling in the red dirt to lift a hill of the buckthorn red, did it come, out there where no one could see, which was how Lucretia would have wanted it, and how Ambrose would have, both of them. People who believe that grief, like a sweet potato, does its real work underground, out of sight, and comes up in its own season as something else. Lucretia had lived to see it. That was the mercy of it. She had lived to see the field feed the county, to see the buckthorn red brought back from the edge of being lost, to see her great niece grow into the ground the way a good slip grows into a ridge, rooted and reaching. And she had not said much about any of it, because saying much was not her way. But in her last week she had begun, without explanation, to call Odessa by the name she had called Ambrose, catching herself sometimes and sometimes not. And Odessa had understood what the old woman was telling her without words, that the line ran on, that the knowledge had found a keeper, that the ground had a Pharaoh to remember it by again. She buried Lucretia beside Ambrose in the little family plot up under the buckthorn trees at the top of the slope, near the plot where she grew the red yams. And after the burying, the county came up Buckthorn Road in a slow line of trucks and cars carrying dishes, the way that country grieves, with food, and there were sweet potatoes on nearly every dish they carried. Odessa's own yams come back to her cooked 100 different ways by 100 different hands, and she stood on the sway-backed porch and received them. And it was the closest thing to a ceremony that place had seen, though no one called it that. Burl Cathy came and stood at the edge of the yard with his hat off, and when it was his turn he did not offer condolences in the ordinary way. He only said that Lucretia had been the last of the old ones who really knew that ground, and Odessa said, not the last, and he understood her, and he nodded, and that was all. She kept on. There is not a great deal more to tell, because the shape of a life like hers is not made of dramatic turns, but of the same work done over and over until it becomes a life. And that is the point, that the whole story is the patience of it. She grew the farm slowly, always slowly, 4 acres to 8 and 8 to 15 over the years, but never faster than her own held-back seed and her own 2 hands and the hand she trusted could manage, and she never borrowed against it, and she never let the bank plant her field. And when the buckthorn red had grown strong and stable and plentiful, after some years of keeping it close, she began at last to sell it as seed, but only to growers in her own county and the ones bordering, and only to people who came to the farm and sat at her table and understood what they were being trusted with, because a good line was a thing you kept, and keeping it, she came to understand, sometimes meant giving it carefully away so that it could not be lost again in any single field or any single life. Transome Kell stayed on and grew up on that farm and became, in time, the pair of hands she trusted most, and she taught him the way she had been taught, beside him and with few words, and she gave him Ambrose's 4 notebooks to read one winter and told him to add his own, which he did, and so the record ran on past the old man and past Odessa both, a lifetime of a family's attention to one patch of red ground, written down in a cramped, careful hand and continued in a younger one. And late in her life, an old woman herself by then, spare and hard-handed, wearing a man's flannel shirt indoors and out, because she had spent a lifetime dressing for work and saw no reason to dress for anything else, Odessa Farrow would sometimes drive down into Harlan Creek on a market day and park by the square, and she would go into whatever store had grown up in place of Alva Renner's old grocery, and she would look at the sweet potatoes in their bins, the red-skinned buckthorn reds that were sold now with a little card telling their story, and she would pick one up and turn it over in her hand. Slow, the way you might turn a stone you were thinking about keeping. The same gesture, the exact same gesture she had made at a loading dock a lifetime before, in front of 500 rotting yams and a chorus of laughing men. And she would stand there in silence for a long beat before she said it back, and the people in the store, the young ones who did not know her, would wonder why the old woman looked so long at an ordinary sweet potato, and the old ones who did know her would not wonder at all, because they had learned, the whole county had learned, that when a Farrow looks long at a thing everyone else has walked past, it is worth walking back to see what she is seeing. If this story reached something in you, do one thing for me before you go. Send it to someone who has been told that what they are holding on to, the small thing, the unglamorous thing, the thing everyone else has already written off, is not worth the trouble, because that person needs to hear that worth does not always announce itself, and that patience is not the same as waiting. Then tell me down in the comments about a time you saw value in something other people had given up on, whether it grew into anything or not, because sometimes the scene is the whole of it. And tell me where you are, what town, what county, what stretch of road. So I know where these stories are traveling to, because I read every single comment that comes in, every one, the way Odessa read those notebooks, slow and all the way through. And I am always glad to know who is out there listening.